One by one, the extermination camps were installed in Poland. Himmler was at the helm throughout, deciding the rate and the logistics of the extermination. Goering summed it all up succinctly. The Jewish question is being handled here in the correct manner, without sentimentality. That's the only way to resolve the problem of the Jews.
A railway policeman told me that there were convoys coming through every day. They found the bodies of 6 children on the tracks yesterday. They must have died on the journey. I asked if the Jews knew what was happening. He told me that the ones from elsewhere didn't know, but those from around here knew very well. They tried to get away when they came for them. In Chelmno, they just recently shot 3 of them in the street.
In mid-January 1942, Yakov Grojanowski managed to escape to Warsaw, where he told the ghetto Jews what he'd seen at Chelmno, the trucks that were arriving with new victims. There were 2 tubes that pumped the gas through. The driver wore SS uniform with the death's head and had a torch to look through the little window and check if everyone was dead yet. When the trucks arrived, a high-ranking SS, a real sadistic murderer, ordered us to open the truck doors. The smell of gas was appalling.
The
news about Chelmno, about the first gassings in the gas wagons, got through from people escaping back to the Warsaw Ghetto, where Ringelblum had his team.
Emanuel
Ringelblum was a Polish scholar who collected within the Warsaw Ghetto kind of collection of all kinds of material that would document life in the ghetto. Scholarly writings, articles, but also ephemera, the tickets that people used to go to concerts, the drawings that kids made in schools. Collected them all.
Emanuel Ringelblum organized the Oyneg Shabbos, whose objective was to create archives for posterity.
For his whole life, he was the historian of the Warsaw Jews, from the start to the finish of Warsaw's Jewish population. In 1939, he started trying to keep a record of everything that happened to the Polish Jews. He understood straight away the importance of doing so, to ensure it would all be listed and never forgotten. But he realized straight away that he wouldn't be able to do this task all alone. So he began to involve other people in the project.
They were writing their own depositions. They were going out and asking people to fill in questionnaires.
Nothing should be hidden. It should all be written down. The police, the corruption, everything. All the dark deeds that took place in the ghetto.
This story had to be written from the point of view of the victims, had to take an unflinching look at how people behaved.
Ringelblum's team had decided to write a book on Jewish life under the German occupation. They'd gathered a lot of material. They were unaware at the time that they were all going to die. They were hoping to assemble all the documentation and publish their book when the war was over.
In the Warsaw Ghetto, Ringelblum's people noticed that something new was happening. Up till then, the shootings by the Einsatzgruppen had been seen as a rather more dramatic variation on the pogroms. And then, with what was happening at Chelmno, with Jews being moved out from everywhere around, and from the Lodz ghetto, they realized that there was a concerted operation underway to completely wipe out the Jews.
A group of Jews in Lithuania writes a historic appeal to the Jewish people. He tells them, Jews are being slaughtered in Russia. You Polish Jews in the ghettos, you will be the next. Get weapons, prepare, dig bunkers, go to the forests, prepare to fight. And in the ghettos in Poland, there is a movement towards physical resistance. But the Jewish leadership in the Warsaw Ghetto is horrified at this idea. How could a few Jews with some old guns fight the German army and the SS? What would happen? It would be a massacre.
People in leadership positions in the Jewish councils calculated that they could save some people if they did not resist, whereas if they resisted, everybody would be killed.
So the Jewish leadership said to these mainly young people, said to the leaders of the Bund, you're wrong. You're wrong to prepare armed resistance. So nothing really happens.
The opening of Belzec and the beginning of the mass deportations from the ghettos, the ghetto liquidations, really begins in mid-March of 1942 with the deportations from the ghetto at Lublin.
Lublin and Lvov were the cities where Operation Reinhard first started. The beginning of the genocide of the Jews over all occupied Poland.
The operation had already started in the ghetto. People had been killed in the ghetto. They'd hidden and been killed.
They were terrorizing people on purpose, all the way from the ghetto to the wagons. It all happened so quickly. The purge of the ghettos was incredibly brutal. They were massacring people right in front of everyone. The aim was to create terror so nobody would resist. German orders were very clear about how the Jews to be exterminated should be treated. They'd come up with the terms apt for transport and inapt for transport. The inapt ones were the sick or the children without parents. They were just killed right there in the ghetto.
The Jews were ordered to assemble at 5 a.m. Around 5,000 of them showed up. Troops swept the whole area, and another 600 Jews were found. About 300 who were considered too old, sick, or unable to travel were shot on sight. The train left for Belzec. On unloading the wagons, we found around 200 had died during the journey.
At the start, thousands of Jews were shot right there, in the town and the countryside. But then they made a new plan. Non-productive elements, such as children and those over 60, were put in sealed wagons and taken to Belzec, where they disappeared. Nobody had ever escaped from there.
Part of Operation Reinhard was the seizure of valuables, currency, all of the possessions that those folks who were permitted to bring their 50 kilos brought with them to the killing center.
Their property was taken away at the camps, but a lot had already been confiscated in the ghetto.
So that the SS is collecting as much Jewish property as it can, and that, of course, is then used to finance what is going on.
There was a big warehouse in the middle of town where they piled up all the deportees' money and valuables.
When Jews get off the train at the camp, they, of course, have to divulge all of their valuables, even undress, and they stuff these warehouses full of different things.
Any paper money and change, though, went to the bank in Lublin, which is a subsidiary of the Reich's own bank. The bank account that paid the transport to the extermination camps was there at Lublin. There was a special Operation Reinhard account. All the money going into it came from the victims. It was used to pay the German railways that took them to the camps. There was a whole pricing scale. Adults travelled full fare, but children from 5 to 14 got a reduction. and children under 5 travel for free.
In the end, compared to what they're taking in, chartering a few trains is not a major expense.
Who financed the killing of the Jews? The Jews. They didn't know it, of course, but they were robbed to pay for their own murder.
The killing of Jews never breaks down because they run out of money. That is not a problem. They're always finding ways to collect from the victims to pay for the killing of the victims.
Every convoy coming into Belzec stopped first at the railway station. The Belzec camp was about 500 meters away. It all happened right in front of the local people and in front of passengers on other trains. 7 or 8 wagons would arrive at the ramp, while the others stayed at the station. These wagons were crowded, and people had nothing to eat or drink. A lot of people had died in the trains. The Germans just couldn't kill everyone at once. At Belzec, they killed Jews in the daytime. There were no executions at night. Throughout the whole stifling night, the whole village could hear cries coming from the train. There were the cries of people asking for water. With each train, it all took hours, even days. There were people collapsing. There were sick people and children who'd lost their parents during the trip.
People were dying in the trains. The Germans picked out some of the incoming Jews. Their job was to clean the wagons so they'd go back clean, with no traces of what had gone on.
They were very brutal getting people out of the wagons, with whips and bayonets. The least sign of resistance meant death. They were shooting people right in front of everyone.
When people got to the camps, they were told, "You are in a transfer camp. From here, you'll be sent on to labor camps." The Jews went in and straight into the showers.
When they were led off to the changing rooms, then the gas chambers, anyone who couldn't walk was left there on the ramp. They brought them out of the wagons, herded them together, and left them on the ramp. Then, once the others had all been gassed, they carried or dragged them to the burial pits, where they were shot dead. They laid them down or sat them on the edge of the pit and shot them. They'd be sat there looking at the hundreds of bodies already there in the pit. They shot the most vulnerable, the crippled, the sick, the elderly, anyone who'd lost consciousness, the children who'd lost their parents. While one group were put in the gas chamber, the next group would be waiting by the entrance to the corridor outside. The gas chambers were built to look like shower rooms.
We have testimony from some of the guards who saw parents talking quietly to their children and pointing up at the sky.
They turn on the motor, let it run for about 20 minutes, until all the screams in the gas chambers stopped. These screams from the camp, from the gas chambers, could be heard by the whole village. Everyone remembers those terrible screams. Then, after 4 or 5 minutes, they died down, and there was total silence.
Everyone in there was asphyxiated in half an hour. Then they'd open the door and take out the bodies. At first, in the camps, they buried the bodies. They didn't burn them. There weren't any ovens yet.
3 young Jews managed to escape from Belzec and get back to Lublin to tell people what was going on. But no one believed them.
We pass by the Belzec camp. There it is. It was just a tall hedge of pines in this sickly, penetrating smell. Are they already starting to stink? No, it's the gas. And after 200 yards or so, the sickly odor had become a sour, burning smell. The hedges were too high for us to see anything.
As word spread of the fate of Jewish deportees, the attempts to flee multiplied. People were cutting through the floors of train wagons. That's when the Germans had the diabolical idea of stripping people and loading them naked onto the trains, so they couldn't hide any tools. Wirt made two rules. First, no Jew must leave Belzec alive. And secondly, none of them must know what was going on in the camp or try to fight back. These methods that Wirt installed at Belzec will be used at Sobibor and Treblinka too.
When the first Jews in Lublin were exterminated in the gas chambers, Goebbels was informed straight away. 10 days later, he wrote in a completely mad passage in his diary that he could not even describe in detail the barbarity going on in Lublin. But that, though difficult, it was right. Because it was the Jews who started the war. He wrote this once he'd heard that the gas chambers, under the direction of Odilo Globocnik, had begun functioning.
Once they realize Belzec works, then they create the second and third camps of Operation Reinhard, then Sobibor and Treblinka coming online, so that the deportations from all over the general government are in motion as the assault upon all the ghettos. One town after another has now become very systematic.
When the night trains arrived at Sobibor, we unloaded the Jews who died on the way and left the others, often up to 2,500 of them, in the wagons till morning. At dawn, they stripped and were taken straight to the gas chambers. The Germans rounded up geese so their squawking would cover up the screams of the dying.
On the 27th of May 1942, Reinhard Heydrich, the chief organizer of the Final Solution, was mortally wounded in Prague in an attack by Czech resistance. His assassination was the first blow to the Nazis' power.
Tausende und Abertausende, vor allem Angehörige der schaffenden Bevölkerung, defilieren im Ehrenhof der Prager Burg an dem Sarg Reinhard Heydrichs vorüber. Plus de 65 000 personnes ont tenu à défiler devant le cercueil du général Heydrich, qui, on le sait, fut récemment victime d'un attentat. Le corps du général Heydrich est transféré à Berlin. L'hommage du Führer dans la salle des mosaïques de la nouvelle chancellerie. Les deux fils du général Heydrich. Heinrich Himmler prononce l'éloge du disparu.
Himmler, Hitler, and many others within the regime saw the murder of Heydrich as a sign that they should step up the massacres. And in a macabre homage to him, to revenge his death, they named the operation to exterminate Poland's Jews after him. The assassination had no effect on the persecution of the Jews, for everything by then was planned out, and the extermination program was already underway. It did, however, accelerate and radicalize the process. And all the threats were taken by SS leaders as an invitation to start dealing with the Jewish question even more radically.
Der Ermordung der europäischen Juden schon so weit eingeleitet, vorbereitet.
It was too late to stop the program now. Everything was in place and there was a precise objective, the destruction of all the Jews in Europe.
Arrivée de M. Heydrich, général des SS, chargé par le chef des SS et de la police allemande, M. Himmler, d'installer dans ses fonctions M. Oberg, général de division des SS et de la police en territoires occupés. Le général a profité de son séjour à Paris pour recevoir M. Bousquet, secrétaire général à la police, et M. Himmler, secrétaire général à l'administration. M. Heydrich a également pris contact avec M. Darquier de Pellepoix, qui vient d'être nommé commissaire général aux questions juives, ainsi qu'avec M. de Brinon.
There was an agreement in 1942 about the role of the French police between the Vichy police chief and the head of the SS forces in France. French police do most of the arresting.
The reality was that Germans didn't have enough manpower and had to rely on the French police.
There were never enough German police. I think there were only about 3,000 German police in France. And so at all times, the Germans needed the Vichy police. They're quite explicit about the great roundup of the Vélodrome d'Hiver in 16th and 17th of July 1942.
The decreed date of the 14th of July was judged unsuitable and moved to the 16th to avoid it clashing with the French national holiday. These raids were neither the first nor the last, but they shocked by their sheer extent and by the fact that for the first time women and children were taken, children who were mostly French.
The first plan was to have people between 18 and 45. And then there was, Laval was saying that it was, he wanted to reunite the families. They wanted to include the children, but there was a whole negotiation about it. And Eichmann then agreed that you could make up the quota with children and old people. That was his part in that decision.
All night long, the Jewish files boxes were being ticked. The lists distributed to each arrondissement were accompanied by instructions. No family member was to remain in the home, and no children were to be given into the care of neighbors. All keys and pets were to be handed to the concierge. The families should all be taken to the Vélodrome d'Hiver.
This begs the question, without France's Jewish files, could the Nazi death machine have worked so well? No. In other words, a genocide begins with the paperwork, the files, with the state bureaucracy.
Before dawn, on the 16th and 17th of July, in Paris and its suburbs, almost 4,500 police, all French, seized from their houses 12,884 foreign and expatriate Jews, among them rather more than 5,000 women and 4,000 children.
The public arrests that took place in the occupied zone, separation of families, and then there was the arrest of children. And these scenes took place in broad daylight, and they were absolutely horrifying to a great many people who were witness to these arrests. Laval and Pétain, they are very happy to send foreign Jews at first, but eventually everyone.
They dragged their heels, haggled, shed a few crocodile tears, but in the end the supporters of the Vichy regime resolved to shatter the sacred right of asylum and deliver to the enemy who ordained their certain death hosts of women and men, children and babies. Of course, they were just foreigners, stateless, not French. French lives were being bought with foreign ones. They were proud of it. Soon, though, they'd be buying non-Jewish French lives with French Jews. They were proud of that. Until, that is, there were no more lives left to bargain with. Then they saw that they had all been sold.
The reality is that the French, essentially the French police rounded up the Jews, the French police incarcerated Jews, and the French police enabled the Germans to deport the Jews. Many of them were foreign-born Jews, which was an excuse for France.
Almost all the Jews in Belgium were foreign. There was a small local population of Jews of Belgian nationality, and the Germans didn't take them until 1943, and when they began taking them, there were objections from the Queen and from church leaders, and they only took about a third of them.
In the Netherlands, people were all down in the streets in February 41 in Amsterdam to protest against the anti-Jewish laws. You'd never have seen that in France.
De Gaulle could have made an appeal. He could have said, "French police, you're arresting Jews. If you carry on arresting them, you too will be arrested at the liberation, and you will be judged." I blame him. I really do.
Laval asked some of the German authorities what they should say to the public, and it was replied to him that these people loaded into the trains and sent to the east were going to establish agricultural
colonies. That was the story that Laval used.
The
Veldiv roundup included old people and women who could not be sent away to work. When you see the famous notes from the trains, the letters sent home from Drancy, you can see that almost all of them believed they were being sent to work in the East.
I would have liked to embrace you one more time, my poor children, whom I shall see no more. Never leave Michel. Never let them send you away. Ask the furrier over the road, he may take pity on you. We leave tomorrow, we know not where. I hold you to my heart and weep. Your mommy has had enough of all these women and their stupid stories. What little courage they have is slipping away from them. Dear mother and my brothers and sisters, I send you these few lines from the train. There are 45 of us here in this cattle wagon. We left at 9:30 this morning. There are more than 1,100 of us. We're heading for the German border. I think things will be fine.
The rumors were already rife that deportation meant death. So there was a transformation of the utmost importance in public opinion. Many people began violating the Vichy ordinances and began receiving Jewish children. Farmers took in orphans, Jewish refugee children. Laval tells the Germans that he can't simply furnish quantities of Jews as if he's in a monoprix or a prix unique. And things slow down. They don't stop. It's a mistake to say that Vichy stopped cooperating with the arrests and the deportations. But the pace slowed down, and then it sped up again in early '43 because of the occupation of the southern zone. But French police continued to be ordered to take part in the arrests.
All the Jews, French and foreign, had been in police buses since the morning. They hadn't had time to get dressed. The sick had had to get out of bed. Parents were separated from their children. Whole families who'd been living in Marseille for generations. They were all deported in particularly cruel conditions, crowded into cattle wagons under German police surveillance, with no water, no food. One policeman, when asked for food by some poor chap, replied, "Our soldiers are dying of hunger. These Jews don't need to eat."
Foreign Jews were deported at about 40% because they didn't speak very good French, they looked different, they didn't have networks of friends.
Les réseaux de sociabilité sont pas les mêmes pour les Juifs français.
French Jews didn't have the same social networks or material means.
La capacité qu'ont les Juifs français à échapper.
And their capacity to escape from the Nazis or from Vichy were limited compared to the Jewish immigrants.
Des Juifs de l'immigration.
And even so, 24,000 French citizens, Jews of French citizenship were taken, which is a shockingly high number. If the Vichy government had not cooperated, it would have been much more difficult for the Germans to. First of all, the Germans would not have been able to arrest anybody in the unoccupied zone until they got there in November 1942. And they couldn't always have the trains they wanted, didn't have enough trains.
They started rounding up Jews in France in '42. My parents tried to get across the Swiss border, but there were some young Swiss coming out of a bar, and they saw them and called the police. The border police came straight away and arrested everybody. And they let the families with children go through. So if my parents had taken me, which they didn't do because they thought it was too dangerous and risky, so they wanted to keep me safe. They tried, but because I wasn't there, they were turned back. So then they were arrested by the French police and taken to Rivesaltes, then to Drancy and on to Auschwitz. At the time Germany started the extermination, I'd say with the eruption in 1942, Switzerland became extremely reluctant to take in any refugees. Then, in August of that year, the Swiss government completely closed the borders to them.
Après 2 ans d'interruption dues à la guerre, des troupeaux vaudois ont à nouveau passé l'été sur les proches pâturages du Jura français, ainsi qu'ils en avaient coutume depuis de longues années. Les formalités du retour s'effectuent en présence de douaniers français, allemands et suisses. On contrôle la marque distinctive de chaque vache avant d'autoriser l'entrée.
Switzerland, with its financing, its exports, and especially with its weapons production, was far from being neutral.
What was Switzerland's role during the World War? It was the banker for the Third Reich. Neutral Switzerland.
Switzerland was firmly situated in the German economic sector. They'd come and go, negotiate and get the contracts. They didn't just export weapons to support the Nazi war machine. There were Swiss factories with Swiss directors that used forced labor. The chemical industry was testing a dubious new product in liaison with a chief SS doctor from the camps. They were actually testing it on concentration camp inmates.
Throughout the war, there was a lot of collaboration between the Swiss and the Germans, mainly because the Swiss economy was dependent on the Germans, so they had to support them. But they did, for instance, get some large amounts of gold, mainly from the Reichsbank.
Since the Swiss National Bank was accepting this stolen gold, the Germans had access to Swiss francs that they could freely convert all over the world. So they could buy weapons that they would otherwise have had difficulty getting their hands on.
Some of the gold that came from these was melted down into gold bars. It's possible that came to Switzerland and other countries later on.
The Swiss were at that time an important hub for works of art hidden away by the Nazis. Stolen works of art, too, were sold and laundered through Switzerland. Yet there were quite a few influential Swiss moguls and politicians who believed Germany would win the war.
Beggars lay around the streets of Warsaw, naked or half-clothed, death at their heels like a shadow. One mother held onto the corpse of her child for a full week in order to get her bread ration tickets.
Of the 400,000 Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto, 100,000 died of hunger and disease.
1 in 10 Jews died not because there was killing, but because there was starvation, malnutrition, and disease. 10% of the population died without a bullet being shot.
Parents couldn't feed their children. And many of the parents died too. The children who survived were reduced to begging in the streets. It was usually hunger that killed people.
They filmed dead children lying in the street to show how Jews were like garbage.
In the streets littered with naked bodies, hundreds of haggard souls were trying to sell whatever little they had just to survive. Women sat, their breasts dried up, next to their listless, staring babies, each face a rictus of hunger and suffering. It was the most horrible sight I'd ever seen.
So they are starving, they're hungry, they get ill, typhus spreads, tuberculosis spreads. The old people, the young people, they die. The winters are cold, are harsh.
And hygiene conditions got worse and worse to a very worrying extent. The typhus epidemic in the ghetto was peaking. The Jews became the symbols of sickness because they were sick. They proved what people were saying. We were right to talk of the biological danger of the Jews. Look, in the ghettos, they're all sick. Gradually, Jews became equated with disease. They'd been so filthy for so many centuries, so unhygienic, that it was no wonder they were ill. And that was what Himmler meant when he said anti-Semitism isn't a matter of ideology, it's a matter of hygiene.
Eisenstadt is 42 years old today. For the first time in his life, he's doing something he never imagined he would have to do. He's carrying the body of his wife, dead from hunger and exhaustion. For 3 days, he has been trying to find the 20 zlotys he needs to pay for her burial. Along with his only son Yosel, just 7 years old, he's carrying her to the cemetery.
Dans le ghetto de Varsovie, en mai et juin 1942, les opérateurs...
In the Warsaw Ghetto in May and June 1942, there were propaganda companies who had direct orders from Goebbels. We have a lot of accounts of these film shoots in the ghetto diaries and from Ringelblum that tell how film crews arrived and directed life in the ghetto by forcing Jews to play fictional roles that were intended to contrast the rich Jews with the misery the others were living in. The subtext was simple: Jews exploited by Jews.
These films were Nazi propaganda. They filmed in restaurants to show how well Jews were living under the Nazi regime.
These films directed by the Nazis are not easy to watch. They were made to show life in the ghetto, when we know that they were all completely set up and fake.
In 1942, ghettos were what the Nazis called liquidated. They were emptied once the infrastructure of the death camp was created, which could annihilate these Jews.
Chernyakhov wrote in his diary that he didn't want to be responsible for the deaths of all those people.
Jewish leadership always had choices between terrible choice A and terrible choice B and even more terrible choice C. You never give them a good choice. And there's just no way someone in a position in Jewish leadership had an easy decision to make, and whatever he did, it was going to have terrible consequences.
What should the Jewish community head do? Should he send off the old and sick people first, hoping to play for time so maybe the war would be over, we saved the healthy younger people?
One of the two chiefs of Amsterdam's Jewish Council was faced with a terrible choice. He said, don't forget he was a history professor, the intellectuals are more important than the workers. This may seem absolutely dreadful to us, but faced with all the stress of such an impossible choice, you end up saying, either I kill myself, or I just do the best I can.
In Galicia alone, 40 chiefs committed suicide. They killed themselves.
And the strategy of the Jewish councils, as the net closed in on them, as they were being choked and they knew it, Chernyakov knew very well they were all going to die, was to try to save whoever they could of the Jewish population. Chernyakov in Warsaw knew they were faced with total extermination. Once he knew for sure, he killed himself.
A witness would recall that when the council met for the first time, Chernyakov had shown some of the staff a drawer in which he had a bottle containing 24 cyanide pills, one for each of us, he'd said.
And when the Great Deportation occurs in July 1942, it is so fast, so savage. Everyone is disorientated. There is no opportunity to prepare any kind of resistance to fight back.
People knew the end was coming, that they were going to die. The mothers protected their children to the very end. Till the end. Children tried to protect their parents to the end.
You knew you were going to die once deportations began. That's the moment at which people took desperate measures. Parents gave away their children.
Some children wouldn't leave their parents when they were taken to the Umschlagplatz. We don't know if they knew what would happen to them.
The system that Nazis called the action is this. Everyone has to go down in the street. You're taken to the carts they have waiting there in the road, and you have to climb in. Then they take you to the Umschlagplatz. There are empty trucks waiting. You are crowded into them, 120 to 200 at a time. Where are they taking you? Nobody knows. But anyone who has ever heard of Chelmno knows they are taking you to your death.
At the very moment I write these tear-stained words, they have set in motion their monstrous plan to destroy and exterminate, in its entirety, the Jewish population of the Warsaw Ghetto. Young and old, women and children. I do not know if anyone will be left to tell of it. The fate of the Jews is sealed. None of us will remain in the land of the living.
Word gradually got through to the surviving Jews in the ghettos. The facts about the extermination, too. People escaped from Treblinka and made it to the Warsaw Ghetto. They told of what they'd seen. People escaped from Treblinka by hiding in the bundles of clothes being taken back to Warsaw.
They got news from other places where the massacres had happened just before. There were couriers between ghettos spreading news about the massacres.
That's the moment the Jews decided to hide. And there were two forms of hiding. There was hiding by pretending to be a non-Jew. And you had to do that. You had to be careful because sometimes if you spoke with an accent, your accent would give it away. You were scared of everybody. Any one of whom would know that you were Jewish and could betray you.
They were given rewards for finding Jews, and they also had pay, which compared to most other jobs available was relatively important because it was a period of real hardship.
A Pole finds a Jew in hiding on the Aryan side. They can be blackmailed. They can be exploited. You have a room you can give to a Jew who wants to hide. He has to pay.
Some tried to flee the ghetto and hide with friends out in the country.
The Polish resistance informed the Jewish resistance in the ghetto that the Jews were being taken to a place called Malkinia, a railway junction near Treblinka, and that the massive convoys that arrived there with great turmoil would leave again 4 or 5 hours later completely empty.
There are certain points at which the rate and pace of deportation cannot be maintained. And there are also villages that are very far from any railhead where it's very hard to get people to a railway train to ship them to a death camp. So even in Poland, there are many shooting actions, not nearly as large as it was happening in the Soviet Union. But there are vast mass shooting actions that take place either because no trains are available or the towns are too far from any railhead to make a deportation operation practical. The manpower for this, quite frequently, are police battalions, these reserve police battalions, which are simply drawn from everywhere. They are not carefully selected like the Einsatzgruppen. They are not carefully trained and indoctrinated. They had not been in the Hitler Youth. They had not been in Nazi school. These are dock workers, restaurant workers, secretaries, very unskilled, lower middle class and working class, just picked off the streets, given a few weeks of orientation, virtually no training at all, and then sent to Poland. And within 3 weeks, they are assigned to carry out their first massacre. By themselves, these people never would have done anything like this. But if you organize them in a certain way and put them into a certain situation, institutional factors are very powerful and, in fact, can turn ordinary people into mass killers. The initial massacres are quite difficult. The first execution at Józefów was really quite traumatic. Many of the men are very disturbed, are very upset. But very quickly, they become used to it. They certainly also get, of course, liquor. That's part of what helps as well.
Most people were willing to do their part, to do their job, that would be ultimately leading to the death of the people.
One policeman even took his wife with him one day so she could see how they tortured and killed Jews. Some of his colleagues objected to her being there, not because it was inhuman, but because she was pregnant. It's not something for a woman to see, they said. They had no thought for the victims.
This is the capacity to turn the Jew into a non-human. The ordinary men who become not only killers, but become cruel killers. People who are carrying out genocide have dehumanized the people that they are killing before they kill them.
Driven by both hopelessness and hunger, people turn up of their own will in the Umschlagplatz. The majority of them are old, sick, crippled, or children.
The Germans put up posters in the ghetto promising 3 kilos of bread and a kilo of jam to anyone who'd come voluntarily to Umschlagplatz to be resettled in the east. That was the term they used. The next day, there were 30,000 people there. Well, was this 30,000 idiots or 30,000 sheep? No, these people knew there was very little chance they were to be resettled in the East because you can't find work for 4-year-old children or bedridden old folks of 85. They knew very well they were being deported to their deaths. They weren't stupid. They went there just to eat something one last time before they died, just to eat.
Après la grande action de juillet 1942,
after the ghetto was emptied in July 1942, Emanuel Ringelblum's archiving and recording took on a new meaning. It was for posterity, and so that the story would one day be written, so the Jews wouldn't disappear without leaving any trace.
People were wild. This was the end of the world. You know, they were all, any of them could be killed at any moment, and most of them were killed. But still, nevertheless, they were writing.
It's incredible to see how many Jews, thousands of Jews, of all ages, were writing, not just for themselves, but to tell of what they'd witnessed.
I'm really skinny. My legs aren't bad. I've got a small waist and big eyes, a little turned-up nose, and my hair is short and black. That's me, basically. I'm 14, and I want to put here in this notebook everything that's happening inside me. Rutka, are you mad? Oh yes, you go mad here. The circle just closes in on us more and more. I don't even believe anymore that I might go out one day without wearing the star, or that one day the war will be over.
You had to write. You had to keep a diary. Everyone wrote. A huge number of people. They collected documents. If you had no photo, you did a drawing. You kept everything for Ringelblum's archives. People were getting it all down because they said to themselves that if everybody died, it would all be documented. When they were gone, at least people would know of the horror that had transpired. Something terrible was happening, so they wrote.
These diaries that death stopped you from continuing, they were a scream, really. A look and a scream.
When he understood that that no one would really survive the ghetto, and they buried these scraps and pieces of paper and monographs in milk cans and in tin boxes, and they buried them beneath the streets of Warsaw, knowing that someday they would be discovered and that they would be able to tell their story through this archive, and their story would not be told by others.
It is my job to hide all the documents for the archives and to hide them well. That will be our greatest achievement, but I know we will not make it. No one can survive all this awful, atrocious murder. That is why I'm setting down my last will. I want my wife Gela to be remembered. Together we are both preparing to welcome death. I want my little girl, Margalit, to be remembered. She is 20 months old. She speaks superbly. She has the intellectual level of a child of 4. I do not mean to boast about her. It was the teachers at the school who told me that. Such a gifted little girl. She too should be remembered.